Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to Ancient Epics, the place where the greatest stories of humanity come back to life. In the year 1812, in a quiet house in the German town of Kassel, two brothers named Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm set down on paper a tale so dark that even they, in later editions, would soften its edges for tender ears. Yet the first version they heard from the lips of old women beside winter hearths contained horrors that still make the heart pause. A queen who commands a huntsman to cut out her stepdaughter's heart and bring it back salted in a jeweled box. A child forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until her feet bleed and her bones collapse. A poison so perfectly crafted that it leaves the victim lying in a glass coffin for months. Cheeks flushed with roses, lips red as blood, skin white as snow, appearing only asleep while life hangs by the slenderest thread. This is not the singing, bird-fluttering story most remember from childhood. This is the original tale of Snow White, and the Seven Dwarfs as the Brothers Grimm first recorded it from the ancient oral tradition of the German forests. A story rooted in the deep mines of the Harz and the Eifel. In the Iron Mountains where real dwarf-like miners once toiled by candlelight, in the shadowy folklore of the Black Forest and the Rhine Gorge, a tale that carries within it echoes of medieval mining guilds, of poisonous minerals known since Roman times, of astronomical omens, and of the eternal struggle between light and consuming darkness. Tonight, let the fire burn low, let the wind murmur through the pines outside, and let us step together into that ancient, frozen world where beauty itself became a death sentence. Long ago, when the winters were longer and the forests thicker, when the great chain of the seven mountains still hid secrets older than the castles that would later crown their peaks, there reigned a king whose name has been lost to time, but whose palace rose upon a cliff above the Rhine, where the river bends like a silver serpent. It was Midwinter, the time when the sun barely clears the southern ridges and the snow lies in unbroken whiteness for months. The queen, heavy with child, sat by a window framed in ebony, sewing a tiny garment of finest linen. Outside, the snow fell in slow, heavy flakes. As she worked, the needle slipped and pricked her finger. 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow gathered on the sill. The contrast was so striking, red upon white framed by black ebony, that she whispered aloud, "Oh, would that my little daughter might have skin as white as this snow, lips as red as this blood, and hair as black as this ebony frame." The wish, spoken in the stillness of a winter afternoon, carried power in those old days when words still shaped fate. Not many weeks later the child was born, perfect in every detail of the mother's wish, and they named her Snow White. But joy was brief. The queen weakened after the birth, and, before the first spring flowers opened, she closed her eyes forever. The king mourned, then, as kings do, took another wife. The new queen was tall and pale, with eyes like winter pools and a pride that burned colder than frost. Her beauty was renowned throughout the land, but she could not bear the thought that any other might rival her. In a locked chamber high in the northern tower, she kept a mirror, not of common glass but of a strange dark metal rimmed with silver runes. A mirror said to have been forged centuries earlier by mountain smiths who worked deep beneath the earth where no sun ever reached. Every morning at dawn, when the first pale light touched the highest turret, the queen would stand before this mirror and ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all?" And the mirror, bound by an enchantment older than the kingdom itself, would answer in a voice like wind through hollow caves, "You, my queen, are fairest of all." For 7 full years the answer never changed. Snow White grew in grace and kindness, tended by servants who loved her, her skin indeed remaining white as fresh snow, her lips red as winter berries, her hair black and shining as a raven's wing. On the morning of her 7th birthday, when the first green buds were just beginning to swell on the hazel bushes, the queen asked her usual question. This time the mirror's voice seemed to come from farther away, as though echoing up from the deepest mines, and it replied, "Queen, You are fair, it is true. But Snow White is now 1,000 times fairer than you." The words struck the queen like a blade. Her face flushed crimson, then drained white as the snow outside. Envy, that ancient serpent, coiled around her heart and squeezed until she could scarcely breathe. She summoned the royal huntsman, a tall man with shoulders broad from years of carrying slain deer through the forest, and spoke words that turned his blood to ice. "Take the child into the wild forest, far from all paths. Kill her. Cut out her heart and bring it to me in this jeweled box as proof." She pressed into his hand the small casket of carved ivory lined with crimson silk. The huntsman bowed, unable to refuse a direct command, and led Snow White away under pretense of gathering spring flowers. They walked for hours, deeper and deeper into the forest where the oaks grew so thick that sunlight reached the ground only in thin golden spears. Snow White, trusting and innocent, picked violets and early wood anemones, unaware of the shadow in the huntsman's heart. At last they came to a remote glade ringed by ancient yew trees, dark and poisonous. There the huntsman drew his knife. Snow White looked up and saw tears on his weathered cheeks. "Run, little princess," he whispered, voice breaking. "Run and never return, for the queen will kill me if I fail, but I cannot harm you." Then, swift as mercy, he killed a young wild boar that had wandered near, cut out its heart and lungs, salted them carefully, and placed them in the ivory box. Snow White, barefoot in her fine dress now torn by brambles, fled weeping into the unknown depths of the forest as dusk began to gather. Night felt cold and starlit. Wolves howled in the distance, and owls called from hollow trees. Snow White ran until her feet bled, until at last she stumbled upon a tiny house nestled against the roots of a great mountain. The door was so low she had to stoop, the windows no larger than a man's hand. Inside she found everything in sevens: 7 tiny chairs around a small oaken table, 7 little plates, 7 little cups, 7 knives and forks no longer than a finger, 7 neat beds in a row along the wall, each with a name carved above it in runes older than any writing she knew. Everything was spotless but covered in a thick layer of dust, as though no one had entered for many months. Hunger and exhaustion overcame her. She tasted a spoonful from each plate, a sip from each cup, a crumb from each tiny loaf, then lay down across the 7 little beds and fell into a sleep deeper than any she had ever known. When the first starlight faded and true darkness covered the mountain, the owners of the house returned. 7 dwarves, small but strongly built, their beards trailing to their belts. Their eyes sharp as the picks they carried, climbed the narrow path from the depths of the earth. For these were no fairy creatures born of fancy. They were miners of the old guild, men of unusually short stature who had worked the rich iron and silver veins beneath the Harz and the Eifel since time beyond memory. In those days, before machinery, entire families of such miners lived in mountain villages, and their small size was sometimes the result of generations breathing air thick with ore dust and eating food grown in soil heavy with minerals. Their lanterns cast 7 pools of golden light as they sang in low voices an ancient mining song about the treasures hidden under the 7 hills. Reaching their cottage, they noticed at once that the door stood ajar. Inside they saw the signs of an intruder. Food tasted, chairs moved, beds disturbed. Then they discovered the sleeping child, her black hair spilling across their white coverlets like a midnight river. They woke her gently. Snow White, terrified at first, poured out her story between sobs. The dwarves listened in silence, stroking their long beards. At last the eldest, whose name was carved as Blick, spoke for them all. "If you will stay and keep our house, cook our meals, make our beds, wash and mend our clothes, and keep everything clean and orderly, you may live with us and you shall lack nothing. But you must never open the door to anyone while we are in the mines, for danger walks the forest in many shapes." Snow White, having nowhere else in the world, agreed with gratitude. From that day forward she swept and cooked, baked tiny loaves of black bread, brewed beer from mountain springs, and kept the little house shining. Each evening the 7 dwarves returned laden with ore, their leather aprons heavy with iron dust that glittered red in the firelight, and they told her of the wonders they had seen far below. Rivers that flowed upside down, crystals that sang when struck, veins of silver that followed the paths of long-extinct stars. Word of Snow White's survival reached the queen through the dark arts she now practiced openly in her locked tower. Once more she stood before the mirror and demanded the truth. "Snow White lives beyond the 7 mountains with the 7 dwarves," the mirror replied, "and she is still 1,000 times fairer than you." Fury turned the queen's vision red. In a hidden chamber smelling of sulfur and crushed herbs, she prepared her first assassination. She stained her face with walnut juice, bent her back until she appeared ancient, and dressed herself as an old peddler woman. Over many days she journeyed on foot across the mountains until she reached the dwarves' cottage. Snow White, alone, heard a croaking voice outside. "Pretty things for sale, laces of silk, bright as rainbows." Against all warnings, the girl opened the door a crack. The old woman displayed a bodice lace woven of colored silk. "Let me lace you properly, my dear," she crooned. And before Snow White could protest, the lace was drawn so tightly that breath fled her body and she fell to the floor as one dead. When the dwarves returned that evening, they found her lifeless. With trembling hands, they cut the enchanted lace, and slowly color returned to her lips, breath to her chest. They warned her sternly never again to open the door to strangers. The queen, learning through her mirror that Snow White still lived, gnashed her teeth until blood ran. A second time she disguised herself and traveled to the cottage carrying a comb of tortoiseshell dipped in a deadly poison distilled from monkshood and nightshade that grew only on the highest peaks. Again Snow White, longing for beauty, allowed the comb to be drawn through her raven hair. The moment the teeth touched her scalp, the poison raced like lightning through her veins, and she felt senseless. And revived her with cool water from the mountain spring and the smoke of certain herbs they kept for mining accidents. Now the queen's envy became madness. In her secret chamber she prepared her masterpiece of death, an apple, one half snowy white, one half glowing crimson. Into the red half she injected a poison so subtle that no taste betrayed it, a compound of belladonna berries, hemlock root, the crimson arsenic sulfide that the dwarves themselves sometimes brought up from the deepest shafts, a mineral known since Roman days for its deadly beauty. The apple looked perfect, shining, irresistible. For the third time the queen disguised herself, this time as a simple farmer's wife, and made the long journey. She arrived at noon when the sun was highest and the dwarves far below ground. "Good apples, fresh apples," she called. Snow White appeared at the window. "I dare not let anyone in," she said. "Then eat with me through the window," and to prove the apple safe she cut it in two, and ate the white half herself while offering the red half to Snow White. Trusting the demonstration, the girl took one bite. Instantly the poison bound her heart. The queen laughed aloud and hurried away, her disguise falling from her like dead leaves. That evening the 7 dwarves found their beloved Snow White lifeless upon the floor, cheeks red, lips redder, skin whiter than ever. They tried every remedy known to mountain folk, loosening clothing, burning feathers under her nose, pouring spring water between her lips, but nothing revived her. The poison had done its work too well. They wept for 7 days and 7 nights, tears falling like quartz crystals onto the stone floor. Unwilling to bury such beauty in the cold earth where worms would devour it, they carried her gently to their workshop deep in the mountain. There, using glass they themselves had melted from the purest quartz sand found in certain ancient riverbeds, glass so clear it seemed woven of ice and starlight, they crafted a coffin that revealed every detail of her sleeping form. They carried the coffin to a flowery meadow high above the tree line, where 7 kinds of mountain flowers bloomed even in winter, and set it upon a slab of granite that had fallen from the peak in ages past. Day and night one dwarf always kept watch, for they feared wild beasts or, worse, the return of the queen. Months passed. Snow lay deep, then melted. Gentians bloomed blue, then edelweiss white. Travelers through the high passes began to speak of the wondrous maiden in the glass coffin, guarded by 7 little men with long beards. One spring morning a young prince from a kingdom far down the Rhine, where vineyards clothe the hills in green and castles crown every spur, rode hunting with his retinue. He had heard the tale and sought the meadow out of curiosity. When he beheld Snow White lying as though newly asleep, love struck him like an arrow of fire. He dismounted and stood speechless before the coffin, then turned to the dwarves and begged on bended knee to be allowed to take her to his palace, where she would be honored above all women. The dwarves refused at first, but the prince returned day after day, bringing gifts of fine steel tools and rare crystals from distant lands, speaking always with courtesy and sorrow. At last their hearts softened, and they agreed to let the coffin be carried away on condition that they might visit whenever they wished. As the prince's servants lifted the glass coffin onto a horse-drawn litter, one of them stumbled over a root of the ancient yew that shaded the meadow. The coffin jolted violently. The piece of poisoned apple that had lodged in Snow White's throat was dislodged. She coughed once, twice, opened her eyes, and looked upon the astonished faces around her. The mountain air rushed into her lungs, sweet as the first breath of creation. The prince fell to his knees in joy. Snow White, weak but alive, smiled upon him, and in that moment the sun seemed to shine brighter and the flowers to open wider. Messengers sped to the wicked queen's castle with the tidings. For the last time she stood before her mirror and demanded, "Who is fairest of all?" The mirror answered, "You, queen, are fair. But the young queen beyond the 7 mountains, bride of the prince, is 1,000 times fairer than you." Legend tells that an invitation arrived soon after for the queen to attend the wedding. Unable to refuse without revealing her guilt, she came dressed in her finest robes. At the banquet the prince ordered red-hot iron shoes brought in on a charcoal brazier and placed before her. Guards forced her feet into the glowing shoes and made her dance until she felt lifeless, her pride and envy consumed at last by the fire she herself had kindled. Snow White and the prince ruled long and wisely. The 7 dwarves were given a house of honor beside the palace and want for nothing all their days. The glass coffin was melted in the palace furnaces and recast into 7 crystal lamps that hung in the great hall, their light soft and pure as mountain streams. And whenever children asked why the lamps were 7 in number, the old dwarves would smile through their white beards and tell again the tale of the maiden who was fairer than envy itself, of the poison apple and the long sleep, of the jolt that broke the spell and proved that even the darkest enchantment cannot forever bind a heart destined for life. And so the ancient tale drifts away like smoke from a dying fire, leaving behind only the quiet glow of 7 crystal lamps and the memory of a beauty that conquered death itself. If these ancient voices touched your heart today, please consider subscribing to Ancient Epics and ringing the bell so you never miss the next forgotten tale. Thank you for watching.